Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana. I almost tripped over my words there because it feels like forever since we've actually recorded an episode.
It has been a hot minute indeed.
Oh, God. Happy New Year.
Or cold minute, actually.
I guess.
Cold minute.
I don't know. It hasn't been that cold here, at least in Montreal. It's especially for the last week and a half. It hasn't been. Yeah. It's
unfortunately,
been unfortunately warm.
Bring the cold.
Yeah. I was laughing with one of the people that I was celebrating the New Year's with, who's from Iran in this case. And she was saying, I don't understand the weather here in Montreal. Like 1 week we have a very, very severe snowstorm, and then the next the snow is melting and there's rain everywhere and you see grass. So I don't understand. It did not register in their minds what was happening.
Welcome to climate change.
It's fake news, Mac. Stop. Anyway, so we both had a active but relaxing holiday season, and we're ready to get back into the show. Woohoo! So we're gonna start here first of all by thanking obviously all our wonderful patrons.
As always.
So as always, we always like to thank them, and if you want to join the show, you are more than welcome to sign up to Patreon for $1 or $3 a month. But for $3, you get an extra show a month that's led by Matt. So that's always a fun time. But yeah, thank you to our patrons, Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, and Paula. So you're all wonderful people, and yeah, make the show even more fun to do than it already is. Do you have anything that you want to say before we get started?
What about what?
Just anything.
Hi, I hope all is well. We're going to be talking about some really racist content, so keep that in mind. Literally,
we're still in the 19th century, so of course we are. Yep.
Yeah, but this because most of the time when we talk about this content, we can always say this came from a place of well-meaning. It's just really misguided. It's just sort of this, or it's a context reflecting of the times. Well, there's a discussion. This is just bad. This is just straight up. The guys they're insolent. They're pig-headed. The evil Chinamen. And it's fuck, dude, calm down.
Yep. It's overtly bad.
Very overtly.
Case. Yeah, but bad. The writing is, I would say anyway, interesting, if not the greatest. But yeah, just the actual content is terrible and should not be condoned in any way. But today, what we're going to be talking about, if you didn't read the title of the episode somehow,
I do that.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're going to be talking about British Columbia because we haven't talked about that area of the country in a while. But we're going to be talking about it in and around Confederation era as it's joining into Canada proper, and seeing what kind of actions are taking place in this moment in British Columbia, and how that's obviously reflected in what at the time was a very successful and well-known book, which Mac kind of alluded to is unfortunate that it was such a well-known book.
Yeah.
But also it's good that today has kind of been pushed to the wayside.
Geez, Patrick, where is British Columbia?
It's north.
North where?
It's so Western Canada. I don't know what to if you're listening to this episode, obviously I doubt you would be.
Why is British Columbia?
Oh, that's another issue altogether.
When is British Columbia?
Eternal.
How is Columbia British?
It's not.
Yeah, I don't understand. Why is it called British Columbia?
So, well, colonial reasons, obviously the British part, but the actual Columbia part, I can't remember. Hold on, I'm gonna look it up. This is excellent content right here. Always looking up things on the fly.
But is it just Christopher Columbus but British?
It perhaps is.
Or is it Columbia the country but the British version? I don't know. We don't need to look this up. We can figure this out later. It's just one of those questions I've always had.
So ultimately, the Columbia in the name British Columbia is derived from the name of the Columbia Rediviva, an American ship which lent its name to the Columbia River and later the wider region. The Columbia in the name Columbia Rediviva came from the name Columbia for the New World or parts thereof, a reference to Christopher Columbus. So yes, it is a long and circuitous way of saying that it all leads back to Columbus.
It all leads back to Columbus.
Because
the greatest man to ever live.
Oh, God damn. You know when, like, even at the time you were a shithead, you know there's something wrong with you.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, so apparently the Columbia
crazy,
comes
man.
from, yeah, anyway. So it comes from him, which influenced the name of the river, which influenced the name of the boat and region, and then British Columbia itself.
He was the most, like, overinflated figure in history.
Well, 100%, yeah.
Chartering the world as round, discovering, like, no, he didn't do shit.
No, I don't know. He was probably smoking crack or something. Anyway.
Fucking Texas.
Yeah. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about, Confederation era British Columbia, or British Columbus, I think would probably be the funnier term in this case. So do you want to start with the history or the book in this
Let's start with the history.
Because I feel like, okay, cool.
Well, so, and then we can see how the book reflects that.
Yeah. So do you remember the last time we talked about British Columbia, what we talked about?
Ooh, it was the sound, wasn't it? The Nuntuk sound?
No, yeah, so we did talk about Nootka Sound, but we talked about an episode about it after, though, about the gold rush.
Right, the gold rush.
Yeah, so we talked about the gold rush in this case, and the gold rush in the Fraser Valley has kind of been seen as one of the reasons why British Columbia as a province was able to become a thing, right? Is because it brought so many settlers and built up actual buildings and so on, and a population that was European, because that's the only metric that the British cared about.
That's the only actual population that matters. It doesn't matter that there were plenty of First Nation and even a growing population of people from China. None of that matters. The people from China were just Hong Kong water rats described in the fucking book. Jesus Christ.
We'll get there. But
we're going to be using a lot of terms in the description that are not our own. Please.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We will make sure to mention that this is from the book, but yeah, it might slip once in a while that we are not necessarily quoting from the book. But yes, any kind of racist terms is not ours. Like, we are not saying this, please. But generally speaking, it's kind of understood that gold rush really brought economic prosperity just by the very fact that it brought a lot of people to British Columbia, or what would become British Columbia. Unfortunately, as you probably know, as someone who has studied, gold rushes like what happened in the Yukon, do these things last forever?
No, God, no.
No. There's more than most things in the economic system that we live, like a very flagrant boom and bust that happens with gold rushes, right? It is the epitome of a kind of investment that is inevitably going to go south, right? It's going to collapse.
The very idea of it, is based around the idea, like, it's a rush. It's a rush to get out everything you need and then go to the next. Capitalism as it's finest. Yeah, no, literally, it's unbridled. And we've dunked on that economic system and for many times on this show, but like in this case, it is very emblematic of capitalism, right? You extract the resources, you make as much money as you can off of it, and then leave towards a new frontier, right? In the case of British Columbia, it would soon turn to wood and mineral extraction, but mostly wood. Yep. And generally speaking, like, as British Columbia would emerge as a thing, right, as a colony, and eventually as a province, colonial leaders that were in the area at the time, names like Amor de Cosmos, who's a very fascinating figure in his own right and possibly insane, right? He was very possibly an insane colonial leader in the medical sense of the term. And other ones like Helmkin, they accepted Confederation not because they actually wanted to be a part of Canada, right? But they like the economic stuff.
Yeah, Exactly, right. It was much more stable in terms of an economy. It was established for a longer time, the Canada, or Eastern Canada as we know it today. And because the actual nation of Canada, or the state of Canada, promised to assume part of the colony's debt, and to build the railroad, like that was part of the major incentive in this case, was the
Woo,
railroad.
woo, woo. That was everybody's incentive. Fuck with this fucking railroad, man.
I mean, yeah, that was the thing in the 19th century, was just railroads. Got to put those
Fucking
tracks everywhere, dude.
gotta get your tracks down there, bud.
Again, like in the context of building a strong economy, like that was the fastest way to travel on land at the time. So yeah, you're gonna want that, and especially if it connects you to another ocean in this case. So instead of having to literally go around the American continent or go north into the impossible Northwest Passage, like,
The mythical Northwest Passage.
I saw this great meme the other day. I forgot where it was, but it was like, the Gillette commercial meme of the man stopping the other guy. Yeah. And so the man who was chasing after the woman in this meme was like, explorers looking for the Northwest Passage. And the other guy stopping him was just like, ice. Just like not being able
People
to
have been
go
saying
through.
though, with climate change becoming more of a thing, the Northwest Passage might become real because as the ice melts.
Exactly. It's kind of wild, like, to think about how history becomes reality because of the environment, right?
Yeah.
Like, or myth becomes reality because of our relation to the environment.
Well,
It's fascinating to me.
life imitates art, art imitates life, you know?
Yeah, exactly. But like, this is kind of what's interesting, I think, for us when we're thinking about culturally. Like, the environment is something that more and more people in, for example, literary circles are actively starting to think about, right, as having an impact on the stories that we tell and on the way that we write and engage with stories, right? Or even how these stories influence the way that we engage with the environment, right? And I think that's a very interesting interesting field to kind of lay out there. Anyway, just thought I would mention that's a thing. Yeah,
it's a thing.
There's an article for you, the Northwest Passage, and how it's impacted by the environment. Anyway, nerd stuff aside, so we've talked about this before, and this has been the topic of many a conversation about Canada. There was a lot of delays in actually making the railroad, and this pissed British Columbia off. Right? We've talked about it in our episodes on various prime ministers and in the episode on the railway that we did. But basically, the fact that British Columbia did not have its promises fulfilled, or rather that Canada did not fulfill its promises to British Columbia in as timely a manner as was expected, kind of set. Yeah.
The railroad took longer than people thought.
Thus establishing a long and proud tradition that we have in Canada of just delaying a bunch of what is ultimately perceived as rather necessary. Right? Oh God. And so it kind of created a bit of a, hold, or how do I, what's the term I'm looking for? It created an
ice.
I can't.
An ice. It created. What are you trying to say?
I'm trying to think of the word for like an ill relationship, but like there's a term for that where it's not cold. I guess cold. Yeah, but
British Columbia entered into a cold war with the federal government.
No, anyway, it doesn't.
As opposed to Alberta, who are saying that the laws don't matter anymore if we don't like them.
There you go. But at this point, Alberta is 20 years away from being created as a province, so we're not going to talk about that for a while. Oh God, the longer we can not talk about Alberta, the better, I think. Anyway, no, we love you, Alberta, but the idea here in this case is that the British Columbia and Canada, or Eastern Canada, did have a kind of cold relationship actually starting off, right, just because of the lateness of a lot of these of fulfilling a lot of these promises. And it would kind of remain a feature of Western Canada, so to speak, like you were talking about Alberta, and we made a joke about it, but yeah, the kind of coolness between East and Western Canada hasn't really left
Oh
all that
God, no.
much. No,
Like,
and like it's still very economic in many ways. It was rarely cultural, so to speak, although that was an aspect, but it's often economic, right?
mhm.
Often the West does seem to be kind of jilted, or at least they feel jilted in insofar as like the East's more historically, economic prosperity. But yeah,
Well, also just like the way that the concerns of the East seem to take precedence over the West sometimes.
yeah, exactly.
Like Quebec gets to throw as many temper tantrums as it wants, but and then they get conferences, they get this, they get that, but then the West is never allowed to do any of that. They're just shut up and sit down.
Be the breadbasket of Canada and
Yeah.
produce lentils and mustard. Anyway, but no, I can get that. I can understand that frustration, but it is
Oh, for
interesting to think
sure.
that it's not anything new,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. Like this seems to be ingrained in the very way that, again, not only the environment, but just the way that the way that these relations started off as, right? British Columbia and Western Canada, I think in many people's minds, the
Mm-hmm.
underlying assumption is still like they're these frontiers, right? There are these things that aren't quite as civilized yet, quote unquote, as the more industrial eastern parts of Canada, or economically prosperous eastern parts of Canada. And you see this in the United States as well. Like if you look at the way that people talk about the Bible Belt or the Midwest, you see very similar rhetoric. Right?
Right.
And anyway, I just thought it's interesting. But regardless, eventually British Columbia in 1871 did officially join in to Canada, even though the railroad wasn't officially built at that point, but was part of Confederation starting in the 1870s.
Yeah.
Um,
And at some point they were just
and
like, you know what, fuck it. Why not?
but it was always conditional, right? If I remember correctly, like a major part of the entrance into Confederation was still the completion of the CPR, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this case, and saying like, no, if this is not done by certain points, we're just going to get out of Confederation, and that's all there is to it, right? It'll be a different kind of Brexit, and that acronym still works because of the British Club. God damn it. Anyway, hypothetical Brexits aside, the project of kind of province building obviously involved responsible government and creating school systems, but it also, and this is where it relates into the text that we're reading today, right, involves it inherently creating a type of population that you want, right, or encouraging a type of population.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the reasons why I wanted to start off with a reminder of the gold rush in this case is that while that brought many, many people to British Columbia, once the boom was over, those people didn't necessarily stay,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh no, they don't. The
So,
boom people leave, and then the boom cities become ghosts.
yeah, exactly, because if that weren't true, there would be a lot more people in the Yukon than there actually are today.
36,000, something like that.
Um,
36,
yeah.
38,000.
And there were even in the 1880s, there were 50,000, 500,000 people who
Oh
went
God,
to.
so much more. Dawson City was huge.
Yeah, exactly. So the very idea that most of these people from the gold rush stayed is wrong. But what that creates, right, is that there were a lot more indigenous people, for example, than there were white British Columbia. And because all of these institutions that are trying to be built in the province of British Columbia are white and European, that is unacceptable, right?
We're gonna take
So,
away their rights
and how do you take away people's rights in a liberal democracy, Mac?
with laws, with
Mm-hmm.
institutional racism.
Yeah. And does this institutional racism go away overnight? Hell no.
No, even if it's not worded as such, it still exists in some form or another.
Absolutely. So just to give a little bit of a background in this case, and then I'll give a few more statistics. So basically these laws, right, that Mac is referring to mostly took the form of removing franchise and citizenship from non-white populations, right? And the goal was to encourage, white settlement. So for example, in 1874, so just 3 years after British Columbia joined Confederation, Indigenous people were removed franchise, so the right to vote. Chinese people received that same treatment the same year. In 1895, the Japanese were removed citizenship and franchise. And in 1907, East Indian people from East Indian origins would also have this removed. So starting to see a trend here insofar as like what kind of populations we want in British Columbia, right?
White people.
But the idea here is not just that you're encouraging a certain type of population, but you're encouraging a certain type of economy, right? So by the mid 1880s, for example, British Columbia, was tied more closely to Eastern Canada because the CPR was completed, and the income of all these resources and metals and rocks and so on, and money and people was managed to make the province a bit more modern, insofar as Vancouver became a little bit more of a city in the modern sense, when it quickly surpassed Victoria as the province's economic center, right? And so for a long time, despite being a part of Confederation, right, the idea of British Columbia as a quote unquote modern province, really came later, right? It really came in the mid 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, right? And this was particularly encouraged because of, eventually in the 1900s, there would be coal mining on Vancouver Island and hard rock mining in the Kootenays, and salmon canning would eventually be something that would, encourage the province's industrial economy. And by the early 1900s, you'll add the foresting sector to this as well, right? So it's really by that period that British Columbia, in our understanding of it, would be a very resource heavy and rich province, right, as far as Canada is concerned. Right?
That's all of Canada's provinces, rich in
that's
resources.
Literally, yeah. I mean, that's why we settled this area. It was just like, hey, here's stuff that we can sell.
It started with beavers, and then beavers became trees, and now we've got all the fresh water. And there's some oil and minerals,
rocks, and
lithium.
Yeah. Anyway, everything's going fine.
We're green, we swear.
And just to give an idea in this case, right, of the populations, right? If we were to compare in 1855, if we look at places like Vancouver Island, there were less than 800 white settlers, right? And most of them were male, about 2/3 of them. And they lived among roughly 25,000 First Nations, right? And so this really puts into perspective like the type of population that we're dealing with in this case. Vancouver Island, which at the time was its own separate colony, it wasn't part of British Columbia, but Vancouver Island was overwhelmingly Indigenous. And you saw similar things in the mainland of British Columbia as well. And, for example, this largely, male diaspora, also had a very early mixed population. I think much more than what you saw in Eastern Canada, or at least it was much clearer in this case, where Chinatowns and African-American populations were already present in the 1860s and had established communities, right? Quite clearly. Some of them had been brought over because of the railways and because of the gold rush, right? But also because British Columbia is closer to, Asia than it is to Quebec, right? For example, right? So inevitably you'll have those kinds of populations that will find it easier to immigrate, I should say, to British Columbia. Anything that you want to add so far to this?
About the shifting population numbers.
Yeah, just like this was just a setup basically of like the type of world that British Columbia is like. But yeah, I don't know if you had
Well,
anything
I
that you
think it's
wanted to
really
add here.
interesting way to look at sort of the history of Chinatown, because we have this idea in our minds that they're like a 20th century construct almost more than anything, like they pop up, but they've been around for a while. Like the history of a place like Chinatown or any of the like other places has been, they are like, how do I explain it? They're very much a strong indicator of just how many different types of populations there were without people.
Absolutely. But I think part of the reason why people don't realize it necessarily is because they were in Chinatowns, right? They were forced into, well, at that point, it would have been similar to kind of ghettoization in this case, but of being over there. Like, we don't want them to necessarily integrate into mainstream society because that's not the type of society that we want to build, even though we're a minority in this case. So if you put them in Chinatowns over there, we can ignore them much more easily. And it makes it less difficult to remove their rights.
Chinatown became a cultural thing. Everybody wanted a hopping Chinatown, Little Soho, whatever else you have.
Little Italy.
Little Italy.
Yeah. Anyway, but like, yeah, I do
Koreatown.
agree with you. Koreatown is obviously a huge one. But I agree with you. It's fascinating. And what I want to do here before looking into the book in and of itself is actually look more specifically into how British Columbia's relationships with indigenous populations and with Chinese peoples, or specifically, but also Asian populations in general, were engaged with, so as to create a province in which the white populations were a bit more dominant in this case, or at least more in power, more explicitly. Because it didn't just happen randomly, it happened through a set of policies, as we were talking about. And then we'll kind of look into the book in this case. So we'll start here with indigenous peoples. And I think this one is particularly interesting because, going over it quickly, how did Eastern Canada treat indigenous peoples, Mac, as we've seen on the show?
Not great.
Okay.
Not great.
What did they do exactly?
Those reservations, penning them into certain lands, saying this is where you live now, this is for your own good, so we don't like accidentally step on you. Unfair trade deals, the usual, treating them like animals, not like people.
Yep. Do you think it's any different in British Columbia?
Oh God, no. I think it probably may be worse.
No, no, it depends what you qualify as worse, probably. insofar as there were treaties that were made, but they do not cover British Columbia in its entirety. And that's kind of what's interesting about British Columbia, right, and its history with indigenous peoples, is that a lot of the time, or at least in terms of the modern history of indigenous relations, there are no treaties that were established, right? It's just white people just showed up, right? And so there are two major sets of treaties, right, that we can talk about in terms of British Columbian history that do give a sense, right, of what I'm talking about here. So the first is called the Douglas Treaties, which I don't know if you've heard of that name before.
No.
So the Douglas Treaties are named after James Douglas, who was the Hudson's Bay Company governor of Vancouver Island specifically. And he was the governor from 1850 to 1864, right? And these treaties are pretty much exactly what you'd expect, considering what you just described, right? But there's an unfortunate twist, right? So these treaties, there are 14 in total, committed the signatories and their descendants to retain their village sites and fields for their continued use, and would have the liberty to hunt over certain lands, right? And to carry on their fisheries as formerly. But at the time, what Douglas had done was he also had the leaders sign blank pieces of paper and had the text of the treaties filled in afterwards, after they had been signed. Right? Okay. And there's only one exception of this. It's with the Saliquin Treaty. So all of these all of these treaties were just kind of blank pieces of paper that, white people had made with indigenous populations orally, and then just filled it out. Try to think of how much of a problem that would be. Thus,
we can't even fathom it. That's the real issue. We cannot fathom.
Right, but it seems like there were some changes that were made, but generally speaking, these treaties, or at least the written text of the treaties, were pretty standard. But it does also indicate just the power dynamics that are happening here and how the British understand their relationship with the indigenous populations, right? Is saying like, it doesn't really matter, right? We can just put in whatever and it's going to be the same regardless. We don't actually care who we're dealing with. Yeah. First of all, there's that assumption as well, right? And also just like, well, it doesn't, who cares, right? We're gonna use the land anyway. And so it doesn't really matter what we put in as long as they sign it over, right? And yeah, basically the language that was written by Douglas after the fact suggests that the signatories sold their land to the crown forever, right? While the obviously indigenous populations have disputed this, right? And it's still actually an issue today, but these first 14 treaties were kind of the basis for Vancouver Island relationships with the indigenous populations there. Right? So that's one very small part of what we now know as British Columbia, but the only other place where there is a treaty, right, is in British Columbia is what we call Treaty 8, right? And I actually put a link in this case to it in the show notes that shows the territory, right? If you look under the indigenous populations section
of the treaty,
of Treaty 8, there's a link under Treaty 8 that'll show you like the breadth of it in this case. I don't know if you opened it up.
I opened up the link and it shows like how it stretches across the 3 different provinces, stretching even into the Northwest Territory.
Yep. So it stretches it mostly pertains to Alberta in this case, as far as like territorial expansion is going. But for readers who didn't open on the link that I'll link in the show notes, like it basically goes from the northeastern part of British Columbia through the north of Alberta into the northwestern part of Saskatchewan and up into the Northwest Territories. This is one single treaty that was made in 1899, right? And is very emblematic of how the Canadian government, again, was just, acting with these people. It's like, well, all of the people on this vast territory are the same, and we just want access to the mines, so fuck it. We'll make the same treaty for all of it, and it doesn't matter, right? But thinking specifically for British Columbia in this case, this is a very small part of the territory, right? It's the northeastern part. And then the Douglas treaties were a separate island. So that basically leaves 70% of British Columbia, 75% of the actual territory that is not covered by treaties, right? And still to this day, by the way, there is nothing, right? And it's similar to how the north of Quebec, for example, or Atlantic Canada is also not covered by treaties. Right? Because at some point, and this I find very interesting and particular to our discussion here, is that by the time British Columbia becomes a colony and a province proper, it seems like the engagement with Indigenous people is kind of like on autopilot, where it seems like the colonial powers just don't seem to need to do that anymore. They don't see the need to make treaties because it's just like, well, we're going to do it anyway, right? And I feel like this seems to be more evident in British Columbia than perhaps in the previous histories that we've talked about in Eastern Canada. I don't know if you agree with that, but yeah, I don't know. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I'm sick and tired of this
Mac,
bullshit.
You had 2 weeks to recover.
I don't. My body is not sleeping well.
Fair enough. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I just wanted to sketch out in this case what the Indigenous people were going through. And there will be other things that we will mention in forthcoming episodes, how, for example, in British Columbia, certain cultural practices of the indigenous populations were banned, right? Ghost dancing and so on were banned for a very long time, powwows and so on, potlucks. And, that's part and parcel for the indigenous relations with the colonial state.
And I think actually there is something noted about the change of the lack of treaties almost, because it makes this interesting zone where, because it's similar in the Yukon, like there's no reserves, and the people there almost seem to prefer that.
Why?
Because they're not, it just means that they're part of the municipality. They're part of like, there's little separation that way. So yeah, they can still get fucked over a lot, but it also means that they like there's an easier way for them to fight with their voice. They can elect their people if they want.
Absolutely.
And again,
but it is also interesting. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just about mixing the culture in with the integration. So yeah, it can be really bad because it means they can be directly attacked because they don't have autonomy over their land. But it also means that they can fight back a lot easier. And they're not like that's one of the major problems with the reserve is to reap the benefits, you have to live on the reserve. Exactly. And then people get their feet, and it's really easy to target, like the fact that car dealerships go up in number a lot outside of reserves because you have all these First Nations people that might get reparation payments. They get a bunch of money when they're 18. They buy booze and they buy a car.
Absolutely. And it is, yeah, I find that duality interesting because the point in theory of the treaties and these reserves is to protect indigenous population. Like that was the original goal. Obviously,
yeah, because people treated them like animals.
Yeah, but then it also became a reason for them to treat them further like animals by penning them up in certain places. Like it's a vicious cycle that's rather unfortunate. But yeah, it's ultimately, in this case, up to the indigenous people to see what's best for them. Like we're obviously not going to make this decision for them on a small podcast, but yeah, it is an interesting thing to open up, right? And when thinking about British Columbia specifically, it's not like these problems went away just because there were no treaties, right? Like the indigenous populations of British Columbia are still very vocal in demanding rights that were historically removed from them, with or without treaty. So moving on in this case to what I like to call the section multiculturalism, lol, no. Right? Because there's this idea, as I was kind of alluding to, that I've seen this in texts before where British Columbia seems to have been, at least more than Eastern Canada, emblematic of a multicultural place that's emerging, right? Because of the Chinese populations that were there, or Asian populations and Black populations and so on, and indigenous populations that were, statistically more, that were statistically bigger in size than white population. But as we'll see, that's, I think, a bit of a misnomer. Right? As much as there are issues with the way that we handle multiculturalism today, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that 18th century or 19th century British Columbia was in any way multicultural.
Yeah. Or even if there were, again, it's that lack of acknowledgement of multiculturalism. Like you can have all the diverse people that you want, and that's great. But if you don't talk about it, then it's not something that you're proud of.
No, exactly. Because again, the whole goal was to make these people not welcome, right? So thinking about the Chinese specifically, literally the Chinese have been in Canada since before the country existed, right? Mostly, there have been some in Eastern Canada, but mostly in the West. And about when Captain John Mears arrived in Nootka Sound, which we've talked about, as you mentioned, in 1789, there were actually already carpenters and shipwrights from the Canton region that became one of the first permanent settlers in Canada's West Coast, right? So already, as British Columbia is starting to establish itself as a settlement post, the Chinese are already there. Like their history is as long, if not longer, than the white population, right? And ironically enough, right, their efforts at building a fur trading fort and ship would eventually help the British consolidate a claim in the Pacific coast, right? So ironically, the Chinese would help the other another empire to form, which will then oppress them, at least in the Pacific coast and in many other. And obviously, as we were mentioning, in the Fraser River Gold Rush, they would arrive. They would arrive in further numbers and with the CPR and so on. And actually, I saw this statistic by the 1880s, because of all these economic booms, the Chinese were probably the second largest group in British Columbia after the First Nations people, which is wild to think of, because in the 1880s, there was not a single Chinese person who was represented in government, for example, right?
No, God, no.
No, of course not. But they were huge.
Oh, it's incredible. It's what, again, it's, you can take a look and think about it in relation of lower class to upper class, lower class minority groups or whatever, like actual population numbers, they will often outnumber the rest of like the different I don't know, the upper class, the majority population, quotation marks, all that.
Sure.
They will always have the numbers.
It's estimated that by the time of Confederation, the white minority was about 20% of the entire population, right, of British Columbia. Right. So yeah, clearly, but obviously they were 100% of the government. So not great in this case. But that's not to say, however, that there were no cultural elements. We've talked about this on previous shows. I think actually in the Fraser Gold Rush episode, that there were, for example, Chinese language newspapers that did emerge in the 1800s in British Columbia and in the West Coast. So there was a kind of vibrant culture that did emerge, right? And, they actually spoke their own language and wrote in their own language. And, often some of them, would learn English and engaged with the mainstream population, or quote unquote mainstream population, as you were saying. But it is interesting to say, to at least keep in mind that the Chinese population did indeed have its own vibrant culture. It wasn't just like we were there and we integrated. No, they spoke Chinese. And part, I think, of the beauty of British Columbia today is that, as you were saying, these Chinatowns have become such a cultural mainstay, at least in Vancouver and in other major city centers, right? More, I think, than what you see here, because we do have a Chinatown here in Montreal, but I feel like when we think of Chinatown, we often think of the ones in British Columbia, right? I don't know about you, but that's at least when I imagine it, much more than here, right? I imagine the Chinatowns over there.
Yeah.
So just to keep going on the Chinese in this case, there would be actually an act in early Confederation BC to restrict Chinese immigration, which should come as no surprise, right, in this case. But surprisingly, the federal government would actually intervene to help strike this down, only to institute a Chinese head tax.
Of course.
It's like, it sounds, but it is wildly hypocritical. But the idea in this case, I don't want to say but, and the idea in this case is like, well, the federal government wants to be in control of these immigrants, and we want to reap the benefits of the Chinese head tax. We don't want to leave it all to British Columbia to reap the benefits of that.
We must have all the benefits and you have none.
Yeah. And so there's two things operating on this case. One, the limitations of immigration, right? Selecting who comes into the country through monetary means, right? But also, there's a provincial federal fight that's going on here that, again, kind of represents the issues that a growing, or at least an emerging province of British Columbia is facing to this very day, right? Of having to, or a lot of provinces actually are facing to this very day of saying, well, what are our specific rights versus what are federally mandated rights? And immigration is obviously one that, well, here in Quebec at least, is still very much an issue, and from what I've understood, in British Columbia as well, right? Always lovely. So do you think, we've already talked a little bit about it, but do you think other racialized communities fared any better than
God
the
no.
Chinese?
Fuck no. Like if you're not white European, you're not if you're not white Western European, you're not gonna do well.
So, we talked about the Japanese and African Canadian populations or Black populations. What's interesting, again, right? For example, the Black population, segregation was still obviously a thing. So while slavery was illegal here in Canada by the time many would arrive during the gold rush in the 1850s, tolerance quickly gave way to racial stereotypes and segregation, and many would have to obviously push for equal rights in the same way that the Asian populations or South Asian populations did, right? And you see something similar with Japanese, who the first arrived in the 1870s, but most of them arrived post 1914, post World War One, right? But even before the first major waves, right, they had their right to vote removed and were pretty much pushed aside like the Chinese. And you see something similar again with the Sikhs, right? Many of them came to Canada as part of the Hong Kong military contingent en route to Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, which had happened in 1897, and returned to Canada to establish themselves in British Columbia because, again, it was closer than places like Ontario, for example. And it's estimated that before their immigration to British Columbia was banned in 1908, there's an estimated 5,000 South Asians, about 90% of whom were Sikh, that came to British Columbia. Right? So again, not a non-zero sum, right? A pretty noticeable amount of people, especially in a province that has such a low population, right? Of just in general. So yeah, all of these are just kind of a quick overview of the way that different people were racialized or forced out of the halls of power, for example, right? You also saw this specifically in laws that excluded Asians from civil service or professions such as practicing law and underground mining, and all of these professions were kind of given a legal sheen, if you will, because the practitioner had to be listed on provincial voting lists, right, in order to do such job. And because a lot of these Asian populations had their voting rights removed, well, you couldn't do those jobs. And so it made it so only, minimum wage laws or minimum wage jobs, right, could hire Asian Canadians. And it was really only for menial and farm laborers, right? So fun stuff. Anything you want to add on like anything we've touched about today, like so far, before we get into this novel? Wonderful novel.
Nothing that comes to the top of my head except for just how interesting it is to see how whitewashed the history of the world is. If that makes any sense, and how do I say this?
In a literal sense.
Yeah, like no, I'm talking very literal. Like we always get the white colonial story. It's very pretty, shiny, lots of fun little villagers, and it's all very, very different from the reality of what was actually.
Absolutely. So that being said, we'll move into talking about the novel, which I didn't mention at first, is called The Western Avernus by Morley Roberts. Have you ever heard of this book or its author?
No, not.
So Morley Roberts is one of those rare writers that we talk about on the show that actually has a Wikipedia page, which is, which gives some indication of how well known he was, at least at his time. And The Western Avernus is undoubtedly his most successful book, right? But what I find really funny is that it was written on a whim. Almost like he didn't plan it out to be a bestseller or anything like that. He just kind of was traveling from Britain across America and into the Canadian West, right, including British Columbia and Manitoba and so on, and just decided to write a travel log, which was kind of novelized in its writing style. about his experiences over there, right? And I feel like it's an interesting snapshot at what life in Western Canada was like, because this book was published in 1887, right? So right around the time that we're talking in this case. And yeah, there's a few things that I think we can talk about, not only the way that British Columbia, quote unquote, developed, right, at this time, but also obviously Roberts's own relations with the people over there. Right?
Mhm.
So I want to start in this case with the title. Do you know what this references? You as a literary person should probably or might recognize what the Avernus is.
No, I know Avernus, and that's where my mind jumped, but I don't think
It's
Avernus
not
as a
quite.
word alludes.
So Avernus in Virgil's Aeneid, which you might have read.
See, I haven't read.
Okay. Yeah. So for those who don't know, it's basically like a Latin version of Odysseus, right? And in that book, Avernus is the entrance to hell. That's what it's called. And I find that explicitly relating the western part of North America, in this case, he refers to, again, Western United States and Western Canada together in this in his journey. I find it interesting that he would explicitly relate this to hell, right? And I wonder if you have any thoughts as to why he would do that, right? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts as to why he would relate the western part of Canada to hell in this case, or to an entrance to hell?
Oh, probably because there's too many colored people for his like.
You shouldn't laugh, but that's probably like a major part of the mentality in this case.
There's probably like too many people that don't look like him. That makes it a kind of hell. It's not like his beautiful rolling British countryside that he dreams of, his paradise.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also, again, like the West is just death traditionally in mythology. You go west, you die, because that's where the sun sets. And as we all know, the sun setting is also death.
Absolutely. And it is mentioned, by the way, throughout the text of the Western Avernus that Roberts did travel with a copy of the Aeneid. And so probably there was a little bit of subconscious paralleling between what he saw and what he was reading and so on. But also, as we were talking about, the West, not only symbolically, has often been, as you're saying, somewhere where you go to die, right? The sun setting and so forth. Or in the history of British colonialism or Western colonialism, you could argue, at least from one perspective, that you're bringing death by advancing westward and so on, or you're engaging with death most explicitly because it is a dangerous part of the world, right? But I saw an interesting criticism of this book, which kind of places, in this case, the association of Avernus to the Western Americas to basically the desire to escape, right? And the struggle that there is to escape from the hardships that are represented by the Rocky Mountains in this case, which are obviously very difficult to get through. Or if you've ever been in the Midwestern part of America, it's extremely hot, for example, and rocky, which I would imagine would very much invoke images of hell for someone who had never been there and who, as you were saying, like is used to the green roiling countryside that you see in Great Britain.
Which isn't true. London was the industrial complex center of the world. It probably looked a lot more like hell than British Columbia did. That's for goddamn sure.
I know, which is wild, right? Which is wild to me. But again, you're away from civilization in many ways, right? And again, when we're using the term civilization in this case, it's like as Roberts would have understood it in this case as, industrial. But I think the removal from civilization in this case is a kind of hell, insofar as you're not with like-minded people. You're away from the comforts that industrial civilization brings to you, right? In many ways. So I guess that could be one way of thinking about it. But yeah, it's entirely nostalgia in this case for an England that no longer exists in 1887.
An England that probably never existed.
If it did, it was like it was during the Middle Ages at best. Like, I don't know much about medieval England, but probably not.
It always existed in the countryside is the thing, but
I guess
London itself has always been like, it's just one of those places that's been what it's been. You know, you dig into its history. It's probably realistically only 1,000 years old, maybe, as like an actual city.
Yeah.
Which I say only 1,000, but you look at the long view of history and like you look at a place like, I don't know, Gaza, Cairo, or Jerusalem.
Literally, what's it called? The Fertile Crescent, right? Where where like the Indus Valley civilizations would have been around for thousands of years.
Yeah.
I mean, Stonehenge was around for a while, but that's
Yeah. Well, so I just looked it up, and so like there was settlements, then there was around like there's Britain, London, but London as we come to know it, because at the time it was Londinium.
Yes, of course, during the Roman era. Yeah.
But yeah, London as we came to know it has been AD mostly, but still it's been around for a while, but it's always been, like you said, like a place of not necessarily pretty.
But I think in at least Roberts's mind, he's explicitly relating to this outside world, right? Where the only people who go there are these rough and tumble characters, not unlike him, who is a distinguished gentleman, as he mentions many, many times in his book, right? How much of a distinguished and British gentleman he is, right? Which we'll come back to, by the way, and how he brings that up way too often to make anyone comfortable in reading the text. But also in relating to the Avernus, in this case, he's obviously explicitly relating it to the Aeneid and invoking like the epic journey that he's kind of going on, as is indicative of Virgil's text. And while it's probably a reference that a lot of modern readers, if they do read it, which, you know, do whatever you want. I don't necessarily recommend this text, but do whatever you want with that.
I would never recommend this text as something to read. God.
Again, we're looking at it from the perspective, like it tells us a little bit about life at the time in British Columbia, but it's not great. Read a history book at that point. But like at the time, the readers of this text would have understood that reference, right? And it would have invoked the epic much more explicitly than perhaps a modern reader would understand. What's interesting to me, however, right, and then we can get into the actual content, I was kind of surprised because Morley Roberts actually was communicating with...
First of all, okay, because I want to make this comment now. This person is obviously total racist or whatever, but you say their name, it comes across as morally robbed, like morally robbed. And I have to say that sounds like something you'd almost see in like a drag, like RuPaul's Drag Race. This man has the name of a drag queen, and we should acknowledge that because he's a racist piece of poop, which makes it even funnier.
Yeah, because he would never stand for that kind of shenanigans. Sorry, I'll make sure to pronounce his name incorrectly as of now. So Morley Robb had actually was in communications with none other than who I think is a much better writer, if not less complicated to analyze, but none other than Joseph Conrad. Who is Joseph Conrad, Mac, for listeners who might not know?
Oh, if you know Morley Robbed, you know Joseph Conrad.
That's true.
Joe Conrad is the author of Heart of Darkness, another interesting book that likes to talk about the heart of darkness and the hell of the world. It is, it's just, he's a guy who wrote a book about Africa.
Yes.
Dr. Livingston, I presume?
Yeah, he was influenced by that, but so it's a story about a man who goes into the Congo, a British man who goes into the Congo in search of a specific colonel, in this case, Colonel Kurtz. And it's become a very famous text, because it's outside of its obviously complicated history and background, it is beautifully written. Like, Joseph Conrad knows how to turn a sentence, and just for that literary quality alone, it deserves to be read. By the way, it has some of the best lines I've ever read in literature. But it's obvious weird interaction with imperialism. Both Conrad was a critic of imperialism, but it also very much reinforces certain imperial standards and stereotypes in its text. So it is a complicated text to read. But what's interesting is that it would seem like the Western Avernus actually did influence Conrad in his writing in this case, right? And I have a quote here from an article that I found, which I think is indicative in this case. A comparison of Heart of Darkness and the Western Avernus reveals a number of similarities. Indeed, one can argue that in some respects, Avernus is a distant North American relation to Conrad's classic. Interestingly enough, the two men were familiar with each other's books. In the letter to Roberts, Conrad wrote, quote, "I am no stranger to your work, even from the beginning, having read the Avernus in '89 on the eve, as it were, of my departure for the Congo." Right? And I find that interesting is like you would have this idea of a travel log in your mind as Conrad, in this case, is going to the Congo, which would then influence the writing of Heart of Darkness. Yeah. By the way, I know you haven't read the entire text. There is no way that this compares to Heart of Darkness.
Oh God, no! I can only
as far
imagine.
As literary quality goes.
Heart of Darkness is a staple of early 20th century literature and literature as a whole. It is the founding novel of the modernist movement, almost like, or if not the founding, is the epitome of the modernist movement. There's no way that rinky-dink morally robbed is going to be able to write something on the same level.
No. But I do find it very interesting to see that these connections exist, right? That the influence that such a forgotten text would have on a text like Heart of Darkness, I think is interesting to think about and definitely worth mentioning in this case. Insofar as both Conrad and Roberts describe places far from Europe, both geographically and in the imagination in this case. And, they construct, in this case, British Columbia and the Congo as venues where European men, explicitly men in this case, strive to kind of exercise the demons of civilization, so to speak, and in some intangible way reassert what the authors take to be, essential values, right? Essential British European values. But yeah, two very interesting texts to put into discussion in this case. And I just wanted to mention this because it is utterly wild to me that something like Heart of Darkness would be influenced by a shitty text like the Western Avernus.
You almost got to think he wrote it to write a better text. That was the influence.
Oh my God, that would be so funny though. If Conrad just wrote Heart of Darkness out of spite and be like, no, there's no way that this is anyway something that should be remembered. Let me write a defining text instead, please. That's canon now. If ever I teach Heart of Darkness, I'm definitely going to say that was true. So getting into the actual content in this case. So there's a few things that I think we can talk about in relation to this text. Right. So first of all is race relations, obviously, which Mac alluded to, but also, the way that the actual landscape and British Columbian environment is described and imagined right, in this text. So you mentioned it already many times, but how, there's a few passages, many passages actually, where Roberts, or Morley Rob, refers to non-European populations, right? So want to talk a little bit about that?
My favorite is the way he referred, because we've seen people talk about indigenous peoples, like that's nothing new, yes. But I think this might be one of our first instances of talking about Chinese people.
Yes, explicitly, yeah.
Yeah, explicitly talking about the Chinamen.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going to call them, right? Oh, hold on, I'm going to need to find the page, but my favorite is when he makes the guy lose his job.
Yeah, so that's on one... if you look at the PDF pagination, it's 212, 213. Yeah.
Which is like, because this man doesn't have a lot of money, his character in his book. And so
you're talking about Robert's character or the Chinese character?
Robert's character. To give context, he's having dinner at this place, and he's being served by what he calls it.
Which is probably the least racist thing he's called one of these people.
Yeah, we were all
So,
at
you know.
dinner, 20 at the table at which I sat, and about 10 at the other, with a Chinaman to wait on us and 2 cooking. Now, this waiter was a very insolent individual, rather strong, with well-developed arms, but had for some time worked in the mill. He was the cause of my leaving this place. Wanting some more meat, I asked him for some civilly enough, I am sure, but none came. Thinking he may have forgotten, I asked again. There's still no meat in any reasonable time. The final result was that I thrashed the man, and someone ran to the office and told H, the manager, that I was killing a Chinaman. Like, Jesus, there's like being a bad customer, and then there's this guy.
And then literally in the paragraph, in the next paragraph after, serve the Chinaman right, old man, said Mac and Johnny, but we're sorry you've got to go. Then they and another went to the office and wanted to know if the Chinaman was to be discharged too. No. Well, said Mac, the spokesman, if he isn't discharged, we'll all go and shut the mill down.
Yeah,
so
like, no. Not only did they get him fired after, then they made him pay for all the shit that he broke when he started this fight.
Yes.
And then he got paid on top of that. And it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this book, because we can talk about laws and so on all day,
How
and
a bill
that's fine.
becomes law.
Yeah, that's fine. That's an important part. But I think this is an interesting example of how the actual, how actual engagements with populations were made, right? Because throughout the text, Morley Robb has no qualms with explaining very explicitly how because he doesn't see a problem with this kind of relation, obviously, right? So he has no issue with explaining in detail what's happening. And yeah, obviously, earlier in the text, this is 162. He does refer, as you were saying, to Chinese people by very, terrible slurs, right? This job is not always a happy one, although it is well paid. For the Chinamen who work on the railroads are the very scum of China, wharf rats from Hong Kong, and are evil and desperate. Constantly, it is no uncommon thing for a quote-unquote herder to get killed or badly beaten by them if anything goes wrong, and sometimes in protecting himself, he will have to shoot several of them when they run at him with picks and shovels. So I think it was interesting when you're talking about the indigenous people, like we've talked about them many times, and there are ways in which Robert specifically talks about them in racist fashions as well. But I find it interesting that, the Chinese in this case, to use a term that is often used with indigenous people, are explicitly described as like savage-like, right? They're coming at people with pickaxes, which seems to be like just a way of defending themselves, by the way. It doesn't seem that this was unprovoked, but hey, they which adds, by the way, to the kind of hell that Roberts is describing, right? He's surrounded by non-European people and an unforgiving landscape, and that makes it hell in many ways. So it's wild stuff to read, right? But and wholly unacceptable.
Everything is.
And just to, sorry, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt.
That's just, again, like, people might scream, but the context, but like, even for the context of this time, this was especially blatant and bad.
And I don't really care about in this case, like, you're a shit person.
Yeah, you're just an asshole.
No one, you shouldn't beat someone up because they didn't bring you your meat on time. That's not a thing.
That would be bad no matter what the time period.
Yeah, exactly. So not something that I would say matters in this case for the context. You're a racist then, you're racist now.
Yeah.
There was another passage, just to compare in this case, with the where is it? Damn, I can't seem to find it. There was another passage, for example, where he talks about Europeans in this case, and I just want to use it in this case as a kind of comparison for what we were talking about in this case. And odd, I can't seem to find it. I wrote down the page number and it does not seem to be. Anyway, doesn't matter, but I can go off it on the top of my head. But it is always interesting, at least when he refers to Europeans. In this case, it's often very much as a state of shock that these types of quote unquote civilized people, and he describes them often as like very well dressed and polite and strong muscular Christians, for example. It's interesting because whenever he refers to them in the text, it's often with a sense of surprise that they even exist in British Columbia or any kind of West. Is like the fact that they are not completely degenerated as a people is baffling to Morley Roberts, right? That there are any kind of like quote unquote civilized English people. And I find that interesting to think about, right? So there's a kind of sense in the writing that naturally the environment will kind of bring down people to the level of a kind of state of nature. And that kind of, I feel, crosses through out the text of saying like, this is one of the levels of hell, right? That this Western Avernus is describing, of saying like, no, it drags people down to its own level, right? Civilization does not necessarily thrive in this area. And I find that interesting to think about as far as British Columbia goes. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add about that specifically, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
It works
Yeah.
for me.
Okay. Just a quick mention for the purposes of it, because I think it's important. I do want to mention another passage in which Indigenous people are mentioned. Here we go. So this is on 72 of the PDF version in this case, but it's or 70 end of 71, beginning of 72. 72, 70, doesn't matter. We came to Calgary, a flourishing and well-known town. Here, numerous Blackfeet had their teepees or wigwams. I shook hands with two of this tribe, the most noble of the Indians. Two tall old men they were, one with smooth, tight skin and glittering eyes, calm, steadfast, and majestic. The other cut and carved by a million wrinkles, but strong and upright, with a kindly smile. Ye two of the Indians must pass away. I salute you. Vos morituros saluto.
So
I don't know if you know what that means. Vos morituros saluto. How's your Latin?
wait, I want to say it again. I want to try and figure it out if I can use another one.
Vos morituros saluto.
So it's something about to do death.
Yep.
Saluto, I'm guessing, is kind of hi, goodbye.
Yeah, that would be indeed goodbye in this case.
Goodbye. So until death till we part, something along those lines.
It's actually not far off. Yeah, pretty much. So basically,
linguistics.
So basically, the translation in this case would be the dead salute you in this case.
Oh, okay.
Or we salute the dead. Which, okay, there's a specific reason why I took this passage, because it is emblematic of how, and he does the same thing with the Chinese, insofar as whenever he's describing a non-European person, he pays a lot of attention to their physical attributes, right? With the Chinaman that you were mentioning in the other passage, right? He was describing that he's a very bulky person and strong, very interested in their physical respects, right? Not necessarily their moral character or their intelligence. That doesn't matter. And I specifically like this passage as well because of what it says about the perceptions of Indigenous populations. Ye two of the Indians who pass away, I salute you. The dead salute, right? Or we salute the dead. So it's interesting, right, to think about that, of saying like, well, he sees these people as a dying race, explicit relation of Indigenous people and death in this case. Not only as perhaps bringers of death, but also as going by the wayside, right? They're emblematic of a bygone era, right? Which we've talked about before. But again, I just wanted to mention that British Columbians do not escape this as well. Last thing I want to mention in this case, or last set of sections that I want to mention, is nature, right? And how this relates, how it's mentioned in relation to British Columbia or the prairies. Specifically, this is the opening passage or part of the opening pages of when he arrives in Western Canada. Right? And when I read this, I felt this on like a gut level as someone who has been through the western part of Canada, where he says, I paid but very little attention to the scenery. This is on page 71, by the way. To the scenery as we passed through the Northwest provinces, which modern day Alberta, Saskatchewan, though it is not so wearisome as the Manitoban dead levels, on account of the prairie being somewhat rolling, with numerous lakes upon it, the haunt of flocks of wildfowl. But the country is uninhabited. It seems to me that we passed over nearly 600 miles of plain without seeing a town or any habitation, save a few small houses of the section gangs. Of the millions of buffaloes that used to be on these prairies, there are no signs save bones to be seen. And then to skip ahead a little bit, just in the other one, I was so eager to get beyond the vile monotony of the prairie that I had my head out of the window all the while for hours before we got there. And I and Mac were now rather in straits. Our food supply gave out after 2 days, and this was the middle of the third. I had foolishly given a meal to a man who had nothing with him at all, and we were now suffering ourselves, staying our increasing appetites with tobacco, right? And he's describing this as he's basically arriving to the Rocky Mountains, right? And then he goes on to describe like the quite the how could I say, the incredible sight that is seeing the Rocky Mountains for the first time, right? After having gone through the flat prairies, right? And that whole section, I think, is very, very interesting because still to this day, I kind of get that feeling going through the prairies. I don't know if you've ever done that, gone through the prairies, Mac.
But, no, God, no, never on the ground.
It is worth it just to experience exactly what he's talking about. Just these flat sections where you'll sometimes meet no one, right? And no city or settlement or anything like that. And sometimes you won't even see houses because they'll be slightly below, built slightly lower than here to avoid the wind. But then you suddenly see the Rocky Mountains kind of arise, and it's really, really impressive. But yeah, I wanted to mention that because I was like, yep, that hits hard, right? And so far as, yeah, just even still to this day, modern impressions of the prairies.
Yeah, that's all I know. But I've never been through the prairies myself, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, we should do that. A Historia Canadiana road trip, just going through. And the last thing I want to mention in this case, and then I'll let you go have a nap or something. This is a bit later from the passage I mentioned, and I find it interesting to bring up in relation to the Indigenous people again, in this case, but because there's a kind of relation that seems to be being made between the nature of the railroad that's being built or was just recently completed and the Indigenous people. Here we go. But no, am I dreaming or awake? For there is my Indian coming down the pass, verily an Indian, and a dirty one, with long greasy locks and the moccasins. This is no pioneer. No, but here is the white man's pioneer. I hear a shriek and a rush and a roar, and as I look up, staring across the foam to yon shelf of rock, on it there sweeps, like an embodied hurricane, the engine and the train, the power and the deed, and my pioneer of Indians looks not up, his thoughts are far away, perhaps to the times before the white man was, or perhaps they are but dreams stomachic as to where the next dinner may be begged, for so has the Indian fallen. What do you think of this passage? In this game, I'm curious.
It's certainly something to listen. It's always interesting when you hear them describe the passage of nature, because usually in Canada, there's always this kind of, not awe, but there's this like regaling of the splendor of nature. Here it's very cursory. Like, again, this doesn't match up to England. This doesn't match up to the good country.
Absolutely. And in other earlier passages, he does mention the chopping down of trees and so on, so, and the destruction of nature that the railroad kind of brought in this case. But yeah, I also find it interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like, he seems almost sympathetic in this case to the indigenous plight in this case, whereas or at least he, again, sympathetic from a white European's perspective from this time, but like, claiming that they're a kind of pioneer for the white man in a case, which, indicates two things. One, that the Europeans would not have been able to do anything here without the help of indigenous people at some point, but also that they existed only for the white man to come and settle after them. It's kind of there's a version of history here as aiming towards quote unquote progress that I feel is interesting in this passage. But also kind of very much indicating what very few texts I've read have mentioned so far at this time, the hunger of the indigenous people, right? Because they would have gone through starvation not long before this book was published, right? And this book was written, especially in the West, where there was a deliberate policy of starvation. And so this is one of the rare texts where I actually see a mention of this. So it's interesting to me that he would make these parallels between the power of the train that's coming in and as a symbol of progress and so on, and yet explicitly relating it to the starvation of indigenous people at the time. And I find it's like a surprising, considering the rest of the text, it's a surprising moment of lucidity for this writer. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say about it, but I was just shocked that this was surprisingly lucid in this case.
Yeah, sounds about right. It's just, there's always a little bit of a surprising past these tales.
Yeah,
they always end up surprising us just a little bit, even morally robbed.
But yeah, I'm curious, just as a kind of last question here, considering other travel narratives that you've read, both in the East and West of Canada, how do you feel like do you feel like there is a difference between Western travel narratives and Eastern Canadian travel and the way that they stack up? Okay. And I'm curious what?
Sorry, just clear my throat. The difference to me lies in Eastern travel narratives don't see as much direct value like in the land. Western travel narratives are very much like, because again, that's how these places came to be, through farming, through oil, through mining, gold rushes, etc. So their focus is on like what the land can very directly give them. They still have some wonder of the land, but the East is much more direct wonder of the land because they live in it for hunting, for beavers, for ducks, for goose, for whatever else they're trying to fish, farm, etc. So that's the sort of like they're all taking from the land, but it's a difference in what and how they.
Yeah, like I feel like there's perhaps a bit more of a compassionate take in the West. I don't know, like because the kind of like industrial era arrived later in the West, right? I feel like there is, at least in the literature and in the culture, a bit more of this understanding of relating to the land, whether for good or ill, but much more than there is in Eastern Canadian literatures or thought generally, which I think you're right, is much more business oriented and less considerate of the land in and of itself, right? I don't know if this is like, probably this is not true when you think of it on more of a macro level, but at least culturally speaking, I feel like this is more true. Like the books from Western Canada, I feel are much more land oriented or environmentally oriented,
right,
than and perhaps those of Eastern Canada, which tend to be focused more around the city, right? Or some kind of nostalgic vision of a former farm life, right? Yeah, but I think you're right. And do you feel like this continues to this day, right? This difference that you're talking about between East and West, do you feel like these ideas kind of have perpetuated to the modern era?
Yeah. East versus West is always been, and the ideas that like, because again, Canada's big. Canada is so enormously, incredibly huge. Like it's hard to fathom the size and the difference in that. and like how different it is going from one side to the next. So of course that's going to create big problems.
Absolutely.
People in Ontario and Quebec probably have more in common with people in New England than they do in West Coasters on certain issues.
Oh, for sure. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like borders are completely arbitrary.
But they still matter.
Yeah, they do. But yeah, I'm curious, like, is there anything that you take away from this episode? Insofar as like either the text or the history itself, is there anything in particular that you're taking away from this?
As much as we were making fun of the rampant racism and everything, hypocrisy and all that, honestly, the history and the book do really paint a picture of how multicultural the nation is, even if it's not always valued. Canada is still very much a tapestry of like diversity. And by the simple fact that we've never been the melting pot of trying to mix everybody in and make them American, it's kept that diversity. Whether it's valued and respected, that's a whole different argument discussion. But it's never been a thing of not existing.
Right. Yeah. It's always been there. It's just we just didn't necessarily want to acknowledge it. Canada for a long time was doing that thing that children do, where it's like, if I don't hear you and see you, it doesn't exist. But anyway, Mac, where can people support the show?
With reviews, with emails, with comments, with hate mail. They can show us to their friends. They can support us on Patreon. They can use our affiliate links.
Absolutely. We're not really on social media anymore, but like you can use it for contact.
Yeah. We're there insofar as Patrick does scheduled Facebook posts.
Sometimes. I haven't done it in like a while. I've just been burned out by social media, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, that's fair. Social media is a pit.
Yeah. Especially now. Like I do a bit of Twitter as well, and I'm like, oh boy. I'm just so happy that Elon Musk
is burning it to the ground.
It's just terrible. What a terrible person. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening. Happy New Year again. Thank you for putting us in your ear holes. And yeah, we look forward to doing more episodes. We have some good interviews that might be lined up. We have some interesting episodes for the new year. And by the way, we forgot to mention this, but thank you everyone for actually making the show bigger in 2022, because we busted like thousands of followers on Spotify and clearly on other platforms as well.
Wait, so what?
Yeah, I think I might have forgotten to tell you, but yeah, just on Spotify we got over 1,000 followers now, so that's really cool.
Yeah.
So anyway,
woohoo!
Next episode, maybe Mac will be less tired. Who's to say?
Yay! Who's to say? Maybe I'll get a good night.
It's the story of my life. Maybe, I don't know. Who's to say? All right, bye everyone. Thanks for listening.
Bye.